Install the lower casing deflector. Install the lower front standard deflector. Install lower diaphragms. Push and insert lower packing spring to the home in assembly mark. Install gland packing rings. Fasten with locking pins after assembling the bearing pad to the lower bearing casing. Fasten with dowel pins after assembling lower bearing casing. Fasten with bolts after assembling the lower side plate. Install the rotor at the lower casing. Fasten with bolts with front standard. Fasten with locking pins after installing bearing pad to the upper bearing casing. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper bearing casing to the lower bearing casing. Fasten with bolts after assembling the upper side plate. Install the upper deflector to the turning gear. Fasten with bolts after installing the turning gear. Fasten with pad dowels after installing the bearing pad to the lower bearing. Fasten with locking plates after installing the back adjust shim and thrust plates. Install the front adjust shim and thrust plates. Fasten with locking plates after fastening the lower thrust bearing casing with lower bearing, and then rotate and install the front standard. Fasten with pad dowels after installing the bearing pad to the upper bearing. Fasten with the locking plates after installing the back adjust shim and thrust plates. Install the front adjust shim and thrust plates. Fasten the stud with bolts after installing the upper bearing to the lower bearing. Fasten locking plates with bolts after installing the upper thrust bearing casing. Install the deflector to the upper front stander casing. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper front stander casing to the lower casing. Install upper diaphragms to the upper casing. Push and insert packing springs to the home. Install gland packing rings. Install the upper casing to the lower casing. Fasten with clamped cold and hot bolts. Install valve caps after installing valves to bypass valves. Fasten hex nuts with tong washer of each the bypass valve after installing the lifting rod. Fasten bushes with hex nuts after installing the rod lift. Fasten with nuts after installing the base plate and control valve. Install the base plate and control valve to the upper casing. Fasten with studs, nuts, and bolts to the base plate. Install clevis after fastening hex nuts with rod lift. Fasten with bolts for fixing the bracket after installing the bracket and torque shaft. Fasten with bolts after installing links. Fasten with MSV York bolts after installing the casing. Install the lower ring after installing the valve stem, guide, valve seat, valve, bypass valve, blowout cover in order. Fasten bolts with nuts after installing the drain cut, ring, and lever. Install the strainer after installing the coupling. Fasten MSV cover studs with nuts after installing the MSV cover. Fasten with flange bolts at the middle exhaust duct after installing the exhaust duct. Fasten with flange bolts after installing the exhaust hood. Install the balance piston and retainer after installing the impeller at the shaft in order. Install the shaft into the out barrel. Install the suction cover to the out barrel after installing the inner bush seal to the suction cover. Install the sleeve, seal ring, and O-ring to the pumping ring. Install the adapter and O-ring. Fasten with pins after installing the O-ring and seal ring. Install the O-ring and retainer. Install the SP retainer after installing the pins and spring. Install the flange after installing the bush. Fix the set screw after installing the nut and moving the mechanical seal into the out barrel. Fasten nuts with studs. Install the deflector. Fasten nuts with studs after installing the lower radial bearing housing. Turn and assemble the lower sleeve bearing. Install the upper sleeve bearing. Fasten with nuts, studs, the upper and lower fasten bolts after assembling the upper radial bearing housing. Install the deflector. Install the bushing to the barrel cover. Fasten studs with pins after installing the bushing and barrel cover to the out barrel. Fasten with the inner bush seal to the discharge stuffing box and then install it to the out barrel. Install the mechanical seal as the previous steps. Install the deflector. Fasten with bolts after installing the lower thrust bearing housing. Turn and assemble the lower sleeve bearing. Install the upper sleeve bearing. Install the thrust disc. Turn and assemble lower pump thrust bearings. Install upper pump thrust bearings. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper thrust bearing housing. Install nuts. Fasten with bolts after installing the thrust bearing cover. Install the deflector. Install coupling the nut. Fasten with bolts after installing the coupling hub. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper and lower coupling cover. Fasten with bolts after installing the lower casing. Install the pinion shaft and the gear wheel. Install the gear shaft and the gear wheel. Fasten with bolts after installing the casing. Install bearing temps to the casing one by one. Fasten with bolts after installing the end cover. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper and lower side cover. Fasten with bolts after installing the end cover. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper and lower side cover. Install coupling nuts. Fasten with bolts after installing the coupling hub. Install the shaft into the booster pump casing after fastening the impeller with the shaft. Assemble the sleeve and O-ring. Fasten with drive pins after installing the SP retainer, springs, and drive collar in order. Install the bush after installing the seal ring, O-ring, and float seat. Fasten nuts with studs after installing the flange. Fasten with bolts after installing the set plate. Fasten with set screws after installing the sleeve nut. Fasten with bolts after installing the bearing bracket to the booster pump casing. Install the deflector. Fasten nuts with studs after installing the lower bearing casing. Install the deflector. Turn and assemble the lower sleeve bearing. Install the upper sleeve bearing. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper bearing casing. Fasten studs with nuts after installing the grand cover and throat bushing. Assemble the mechanical seal in order. Fasten with bolts after installing the bearing bracket to the booster pump casing. Install the deflector. Fasten nuts with studs after installing the lower bearing casing. Turn and the lower sleeve bearing. Install the upper sleeve bearing. Install the ball cover after installing the ball bearing. Fasten with the bearing nut. Fasten with bolts after installing the upper bearing casing. Fasten with bolts after installing the bearing cover. Fasten with coupling nuts. Fasten coupling bolts with nuts after installing the coupling hub.